money historically is so taboo, but when we actually address this directly and feel like we can handle this together, our bond will be so much stronger. Unfortunately, the paradox is the more you cling for reassurance, the more they're going to withdraw.
Dr. Sabrina Romanoff is a clinical psychologist and writer featured in the New York Times and Forbes, helping people navigate heartbreak, trauma, and the pursuit of purpose.
Dr. Sabrina Romanoff, I'm so happy to have you here today. Thanks for joining us. All of our listeners who don't already know you, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into psychology.
So I'm the youngest of 4 kids, and there's an 8-year age gap between me and my oldest sibling. So a lot of my life I've spent understanding and exploring the world really through their eyes. And it kind of instilled this introspective nature in me, understanding how they each grew up in the same environment, but navigated the world in such different ways. And then through the years, I really grew and lived with my patients. I've experienced the lowest lows of life through tragedy and death and divorce with them, all the way to the highest highs of finding their life partner or their dream job or finding their life purpose. So I found that life is all about the very high highs and the low lows because that just makes up a really full life. So it kind of instilled a sense of gratitude for taking it all in. And I think every clinical session, every day, it's the opportunity to really see the eyes in the world through another human's experience. And that's a really great gift of the work.
Who do you typically work with in your practice?
So I work with a lot of individuals and couples. So usually people who are very high functioning and achieving, people in their 20s and 30s, a lot of doctors, lawyers, people who are self-starters, entrepreneurs. So a lot of the times they're very successful in their careers, but their personal life might be a little bit messy or stagnant. So we work on kind of correcting for that or exploring the challenges that come up in their relationships.
What led you to work with couples and specializing in relationship dynamics?
Great question. I think relationships really are transformative and they're the heartbeat of our existence. When you think back to a pivotal time in your life, it's often the relationships that segment it. I think I've also witnessed the transformative effect that a really strong relationship can have. And once you have that secure base, it could create ripples in all your other relationships. I also feel like relationships are never boring. There's always something exciting, a new spark or challenge or thing to unlock. And it's really exciting to be a part of the process of helping couples understand and how to explore the next chapter in the relationship.
At what point in their relationship do couples typically come to you? Is it in the very beginning stages when they're first dating, or is it while they're married?
Great question. It's really all the above, especially these days. People are feeling less of a stigma around therapy, and instead it's
Which I think is so great.
absolutely, because it really can help you get ahead of things and plan for the future before you're in panic mode.
Yeah.
A lot of couples, unfortunately, will come to me or start couples therapy as a Hail Mary. They've reached kind of the end of the line and it feels like it's the last stop before they split. And it's kind of hard to make decisions once you're in crisis mode, similar to a prenup. The whole idea is to kind of get ahead of the problem, plan for the future before you really are in crisis.
So do you think that everybody in a relationship should be in couples therapy even before they need it?
Loaded question to a psychologist. Everyone can benefit from a third party to help get the tools to kind of get unstuck, but not everyone needs therapy and it might not benefit every couple. It's really about understanding what could be best and most helpful in your situation.
Definitely. And I think it's oftentimes how people go about it. So I know I've experienced this in my own personal life, and many people do, where they're using couples therapy as a way to like prove that their partner is wrong in some way. Do you see any of that dynamic in your practice?
Absolutely. And I think that is underpinning so much of why couples come to see therapy. They're looking for a referee, but a biased referee to kind of take their side.
Yeah.
And that goes along with the I versus you position, kind of trying to find the winner in an argument. But no one ever actually wins with that setup. Even if you do win an argument, your partner is going to feel so like betrayed and hurt that they're going to try to over index or compensate to try to win the next one. And it's going to be a continual process. Couples therapy, as the therapist, is all about understanding both people's sides. Oftentimes, some perspective will feel more compelling and you might be pulled to different sides, and the work is really making space for both people. So the couples therapist is trying to create more space for both people's needs until the couple can do that for themselves.
And so it's really about the couples learning those skills, those communication skills, right?
Absolutely. So the cliche is that most couples come to therapy because they're struggling with communication.
Yeah.
And that's kind of only a superficial surface level examination. Underneath that, we all have really great skills in communicating,
Yeah.
but we have a skill breakdown when it comes to communicating with our partners, often because we don't feel emotionally safe. And that's at the core of most of these issues. So it's about creating emotional safety first and then being able to use our skills to communicate.
Does this tie in at all with the attachment styles?
1,000%.
Okay.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head.
Yeah.
Our struggle to communicate, it's twofold, and it's co-constructed of what we're bringing to the relationship and what our partner is bringing.
So for anyone who doesn't know, will you walk through the attachment styles?
Okay, so there's three main types of attachment styles. On one end, there's the anxious attachment, and that's when you feel that the person you're attaching to, originally your parent, but later in life becomes your partner, they're pulling away, and so your needs amp up and you become even louder. And then unfortunately, the paradox is the more you kind of cling for reassurance that they're there, the more they're going to withdraw. And then on the other end, there's the avoidant. That person might feel really overwhelmed by love, by feeling really connected and seen. Historically, through a parent's eyes, they might feel like that's going to completely engulf them. They're going to have no autonomy, and love is going to take them over completely. So they're terrified of really being seen, and they're going to pull away. And the more they pull away, unfortunately, again, their partner is going to become more anxious. So oftentimes, we have both of these sides in us, and depending on our partner, we become polarized. So if they're a bit avoidant, we might become more anxious, and vice versa. And then in the middle, which we all try to aim towards, is the elusive, secure attachment. That's when you're able to be more flexible and know that your partner is going to be there. They're a secure base, and you don't need to back away. You don't need to move forward. You know that they're going to come to you.
Do you think knowing your attachment style is important when entering a relationship?
Absolutely. Knowing your attachment style and your tendencies to get triggered is really helpful.
And how do you know? How do you know what your attachment style is? Because I would venture to guess that most people will say, "Oh, I'm secure. Of course I'm secure," unless they've done some serious introspection.
There's great books about this. One is called Attached that I find really helpful. I think there's a lot of misnomers about attachment theory. Most people are very healthy and flexible, and they bend into both realms. So they can be anxious with one partner or in one situation and avoidant with another. And it's all about really just having insight into how you might be dipping your toe into each identity.
And so you must see this come out in their communication and therapy.
Absolutely. Your partner will polarize you in sometimes the most unhelpful ways, and the key is not acting on that. So Viktor Frankl, he is a psychoanalyst and went through concentration camps, and he has this great quote that between stimulus and response is space, and in that space you always have time to intentionally decide how you want to react. So it's really key to create more space in how you're going to respond to your partner intentionally instead of automatically acting on your fears.
So if your partner says something inflammatory or, and it all comes back to prenups, right? If your partner brings up the prenup and you're not ready to have that conversation before you react, you take time. Is that the suggestion?
Absolutely. It's all about really noticing what's coming up for you, and that could come up based on what's happening in front of you with your partner, but also your past. Prenups have so many connotations and stigmas about maybe protecting yourself or kind of blindsiding your partner, but it really could be an act of care and planning for your future so you both can feel secure and on the same page.
I think that the breakdown in communication for most couples happens slowly and it happens over time. And in working in divorce law, I would see clients come in and we would have a conversation about their, desire for divorce or the fact that they're thinking about it at that time, not necessarily ready to move forward. And then they go to couples counseling. And then years later, they come back. And then they go to couples counseling. Years later, they come back. It's like they get in this cycle where, they can't communicate. And then despite all of their efforts, they don't really get anywhere. As a couples therapist, do you see couples where you're just like, this isn't going to work? And do you tell them that?
Great question. And I think when you come to couples therapy, you're really at the end of your rope. You feel like you two can't figure it out together. You need to kind of outsource and bring in a third party. So I think there's an element of that in all people or couples that are at couples therapy.
Yeah.
There's this fear, and that's on the table of kind of walking away. And I think it's actually a helpful fear when you know that's on the table. Both people really also have to work hard to make it work. So I think both things can be true. That can be entertaining the option of maybe leaving the relationship, but also as long as both people really want to try, that will usually override that fear. So it's all about your intention, and if your hope um, is kind of superseding the fear.
And if we're talking about communication and couples starting communication, a lot of that starts, as we've talked about, at the beginning of the relationship. You set this dynamic. That's probably the dynamic you proceed through most of the relationship with. If someone feels like they're in a spot where they just can't change that dynamic or they don't know how to, what would your suggestion to them be?
It's a great question, and a lot of people feel stuck, especially in the trajectory of relationships. You have the honeymoon phase,
Yeah.
everything's amazing, and then you hit the
And
6
how
or
long is the honeymoon phase?
Great question. It depends on the couple, it depends on what they have going on in their lives, usually about 6 to 7 months.
Okay.
After that, you're usually meeting the friends, you're fully integrated into each other's lives, and you're fully seeing each other's flaws. And it's usually a huge rupture between everything going so well to all these new challenges. And that's usually the make or break period. And that's why it's so important to get ahead of these conflicts before they become kind of insidious, like you said, and cause greater cracks to the foundation. So I think it's really helpful to create rituals that are really healthy and focus around creating space for each other and checking in. So you could have a nightly ritual of saying, hey, how are we doing? How are you feeling in the relationship? Or are your needs really being met? And also truly taking time to understand your partner, not assuming that you know them or having them follow the similar script. So exploring their dreams, their goals, and how they're really feeling in the relationship.
And with respect to communicating about money, I think money is one of the most taboo topics in a relationship. Um, how should couples go about that? I mean, it's such a difficult thing for people to broach, especially before they're married and they're not really sharing the responsibility of bills or taxes.
Absolutely. It's not a necessity. So most couples avoid it for as long as they
Yeah.
can, which can lead to a really big buildup and breakdown, unfortunately. Historically, money has been so taboo and so uncomfortable to talk about, but it usually leads to miscommunication and bigger blowups in the future. So it's so helpful to get ahead of it in the beginning. And you can start really slow. It's not so much about the content of what you're saying, but really the process of how you're approaching it. So be really thoughtful and deliberate and approach it as something that you want to be proactive about. It's an act of care. You want to make sure you're on the same page to really set yourself up for success.
But how do you start that conversation? So if realistically, you're dating someone and you feel like it's serious, you're either living together or you're planning to get engaged. How do
Mhm.
you realistically start the conversation about all the things that relate to money, where we want to live, whether or not I want to be a stay-at-home mom? Like how do you really start that conversation?
First, before you even have the conversation, I would check in with yourself to really get clear of what you want and why you might want that. For example, stay at home mom, is that what you watched your parents do? Are you
Yeah.
kind of basing your financial future and how you imagine it based on what you had? And then really examine that. Is that something that you choose for yourself, or is it a pattern that you're recreating? I think a lot of our templates for our financial future, unfortunately, are like copied and pasted from the past. And we're just living in such a different world today. Women are, in a lot of ways, outperforming and out earning the women of the past.
Yeah.
And I think our expectations need to change that. So, first, really get clear on what you want for your partnership. And then, two, I would start small always. It's really about the fear, not so much the conversation at first.
Yeah.
So, overcome that fear, dip your toe into that scary pond and start small. It could be about how you're managing finances in the beginning. How do you feel about paying for this and I pay for that? And then starting the conversation and then letting it grow from there and really being curious. It's not about demanding or getting your partner to meet you exactly where you're at. It's about compromise. So be curious about what they're envisioning and how it coincides with yours.
So communication is really fascinating to me in relationships because in my own marriage, communication broke down to the point where there was just so much resentment in the relationship. And I think looking back, I used the excuse of telling the truth as a way to say whatever I felt in an unfiltered way. And what I learned is that the truth can lead to this death spiral of communication where you really can't come back. And the truth in a relationship isn't necessarily the facts, right? The truth in a relationship is oftentimes how that statement lands for your partner, how they feel about it, how that affects your relationship. What would you say to couples who feel like, they're struggling in that way? One person is telling the truth, while the other is saying, well, I'm just hurt by what you're saying. How can they handle a situation like this?
Such a great question. And I think it brings up the idea of subjectivity and what is the ultimate truth in relationships, right? There's two different perspectives, and then there's somewhere in the middle, which is why couples therapy can be so helpful. Oftentimes, the truth is bolstered by facts, but underneath that, it's the feeling, like you said. And the truth ultimately might be that hurt or feeling of disconnection, or like your partner isn't really in your corner. And then we create a story that maps onto that feeling. And that can be a really hurtful story that ultimately destroys the relationship. So it's funny, it's about making a shift between how can you communicate that hurt so you can facilitate repair instead of kind of making your partner feel that hurt right back. It's kind of like hot potato. When we share our truths and our pain, it in a way that isn't helpful, it can make our partner want to throw that hurt right back onto us.
How do you realistically do that? So if you want to have a conversation about, this is how I feel about something and it hurts, what does that conversation look like?
One, it's about understanding your hurt and taking a step back because when we react impulsively on our hurt, we might throw jabs. So we have our boxing gloves on, and that never really results in a repair. So instead, take some time, take a step back. I often tell couples to take a walk, write it out. And oftentimes, when you come back to what you wrote, you realize you don't exactly feel that way. The anger is usually the top layer, and then there's usually so much underneath that. And then how to actually communicate, there's something called nonviolent communication. And the idea is that you are completely centered in I statements. So you're not being defensive, you're not pointing fingers, you're saying, this is how I feel. And it's actually really challenging to do. We sometimes go through mental gymnastics to do that, but it's about really sharing your experience in a way that your partner can hear you so they're not defensively reacting to it. Oftentimes, when we're being defensive and throwing out you statements, our partner is going to kind of plug their ears and all their effort is going into protecting themselves and they don't have the wherewithal to really hear you. So, you want to try to say things in ways that your partner can really hear and receive.
Communication leading up to a wedding is really complicated. And most of our listeners are people who are getting engaged and going through the process of planning a wedding or planning their life together. A wedding represents that logistical nightmare where you are both dealing with a very expensive experience, right? Weddings are thousands and thousands of dollars. And you're integrating in family. You have a lot of outside opinions coming in. And at the same time, you're trying to focus on what's next in your life for your partner. How can couples use the difficulty that comes with planning a wedding to better their communication?
Great question. I think whoever branded weddings as this blissful, happy, easy time is
They clearly never had
incredible.
one.
Absolutely. A same PR person doing Brussels sprouts.
Yeah.
But I think the conflict or the challenge is our expectations when they don't meet reality. Instead, it's much more helpful to understand how all these challenges, they're going to help you grow, right? Ruptures, disagreements, they're inevitable in relationships, and it's all about the repair that helps you to grow stronger. So, whatever comes up around the wedding, whether it's about planning your future, understanding how to integrate these two families, finances, try to take it in stride and think, how can this actually make us grow stronger instead of kind of armoring you or kind of creating this rupture between you and your partner?
And how can you work on that communication with with your partner's family? So oftentimes that can be really difficult. We all know that trope about the mother-in-law, oh my God, she's so difficult. What tips do you have for couples who are experiencing difficulty with each other's families?
Great question, and so incredibly common, pretty ubiquitous when you're merging two very complicated family dynamics. I would say one, to start with compassion. Weddings and times of transition where there are members coming in or out of a family are often very difficult for people. And it's because people fear or question where their identity stands in the family. Usually before a marriage, the parents, they are in the highest position of power among their children. And then once new partners come in and they're having children, The power dynamic shift in families and hierarchies, and that's totally understandable for people to act out because we're reestablishing a new hierarchy. So I would say one, have compassion for your future in-laws because they're often just curious and want to know maybe where they stand. And underneath that, maybe acting out is really a desire to be a part of this new life that you're creating. I love the quote, "They're doing it for them, not against you." People often act in terms of self-preservation and not to hurt other people. So it can feel like there's all these tropes, right? It's your wedding, it should be your day, but it's really the whole family's wedding and to kind of create space for everyone's different feelings that come up around it.
Let's talk about prenups for a minute. What would you say to a couple who is struggling with the concept of a prenup? Maybe one of them brought it up and the other is a little bit resistant. How would you suggest they facilitate that conversation?
Great question. One is really check your assumptions. Does it feel like you have some connotations about it being coercive, unfair? Do you have fears about the outcome of the prenup? I would also consider what your hopes are for it. Do you hope to find safety, security, or do you feel like you're going to be coerced into something? So there's so many connotations when it comes to prenups, and I think it's really helpful to understand maybe where those come from and kind of throw them back if they're not really your beliefs.
And what is the best way for that partner who is the one initiating the prenup to bring it up?
Great question. So often it's partially about the content in the prenup, but it's really the process of how you're bringing it up. How are you framing it? And you should be really intentional when it comes to planning for the future, making sure that this is an opportunity for both of your needs to be met and to feel like you both are on the same path. It's preventing misunderstandings and conflicts way ahead of time. You're really getting ahead of issues in the relationship. And when framed through that way, this is about taking care of you both and making sure you both feel safe. It's a much easier way to facilitate those conversations.
I totally agree, obviously. And I think it's really important. Like a prenup is just as much an emotional document as it is a legal one. And a really well drafted prenup will take into account both parties' wants, needs, wishes, plans for the future. And again, it can't account for everything, but I think the most important part of a prenup is it starts that communication, it starts that conversation. And so many couples, I'm sure you've seen many of them, go into a marriage and they don't know what they want or they haven't communicated what they want for what happens after they get married. They're so focused on the wedding. They're so focused on the prenup and what that means. And what they're not focusing on is everything that's coming. And I can tell you from my personal experience and the experience of many of my friends, the hardest part of relationship happens after you're married. It happens when things start to really calm down, meaning there's no party planning happening. You get into the groove of real life. You start talking about having kids or you start having kids. And now you're dealing with a whole other world of complexity around child rearing and values and what religion do we want to raise our child and how do we want to parent? What is our parenting philosophy? And so I just to reiterate your point, I think a prenup is a tool for communication. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I like the way you phrase that it can be such a whirlwind, the beginning phase of a relationship. And it's almost like a merry-go-round. Society kind of predetermines all the steps of what we should be doing. And it's so easy to get distracted and kind of just move with the momentum of all of that. And unless you're being really deliberate and conscious and methodical about the actual future, what you're really choosing for your lives, it could be really easy for all that to get swept under the rug and then kind of blow up in your faces after all that momentum ends.
A prenup forces couples to have these conversations that they otherwise would be avoiding. Finances, expectations, life planning, and
Absolutely. A prenup is almost like a crash course in effective communication. We're all often very effective communicators, but the skill breaks down when we're not feeling safe. A prenup is a great way to start these conversations and create the foundation for having these sometimes difficult conversations. Money, as we talked about, historically is so taboo, but when we actually address them directly and feel like we can handle this together, our bond will be so much stronger. And so it's almost like exposure therapy and having more repetitions under your belt. If you can handle this together, you can handle so many other things and you'll have more confidence and won't feel like you have to avoid these conversations down the road.
for sure. And it's like a blueprint for your marriage. And 82% of HelloPrenup couples say they actually feel closer after they finish the prenup process, which is something I never could have imagined years ago, right? Like a prenup was always really adversarial in nature. And one of the reasons, again, here I am talking about prenups, but one of the reasons I think HelloPrenup is so effective and has been so valuable to couples is because it's this two-party system. So it's forcing them to have conversations as they're walking through these really taboo topics.
Well, it's a testament to really taking both people's needs and making sure both are met versus the old stigma of one person protecting their assets and the other
Right.
person having to go along with it.
Have you had any couples therapy clients where you experience this with them, the prenup process or the stress of negotiating what postmarital life will look like?
Absolutely. And it's a process that comes up throughout the relationship, but in a bigger way when it comes to pre marriage. I think it's ultimately about negotiating both people's needs and still preserving attachment to your partner. Growing up, we're often taught that in order to preserve attachment to our loved one, ultimately our parents, and now our romantic partner, we have to suppress our needs in the process. And I think that's a fear that a lot of people have.
And especially for women.
Especially for women, yes. Women are taught that marriage is the ultimate prize, and maybe to finally reach that finish line, they're gonna have to make all these sacrifices to get there.
And then I think for a lot of women, once they do get married, it's like sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. And that can become really taxing on relationships. And I've seen it destroy relationships where otherwise, I mean, they were so happy. And once they got married and started dealing with those, mundane, everyday life scenarios, it just became really difficult to continuously give up what one might want or need in a relationship.
Absolutely, it's such a common experience. The relationship, marriage, you and your partner are going to grow so much, hopefully, in the course of your relationship, and that's a good thing. But it's also so important to check in with each other so you're not growing apart. Your life is going to change drastically through the course of your relationship, and it's so important to create these rituals of regularly checking in with each other and seeing what's working and what's not, and course correcting. You're constantly iterating and kind of changing up the dynamic in your relationship, and you should be experimenting with each other.
As we've been talking about, oftentimes the dynamic in a relationship changes over time, over the course of the marriage, when there's a shift in careers, when there's a child, or a move, right? So what can couples do in a long-term relationship when they're having compatibility issues or they are regularly disagreeing about whatever it is, who's washing the dishes, who's emptying, who's doing the laundry?
Great question. Look, disagreements are inevitable in relationships, and it's not about avoiding them, it's about learning how to approach them in a helpful way. Ruptures are inevitable, but it's all about the repair because that's what brings you two closer together. One skill that I love is called the pause button method. And when emotions run really high, when you feel like things are really hot, press pause and say, hey, let's return to this later. And it's most helpful when you decide a place and time when you are going to discuss this. Don't keep on pushing it down the line.
Okay, so if you're getting in an argument, you say, we're going to press the pause button, and you just walk away. And then when do you decide to reconvene and have the conversation?
So before you reconvene, it's about actually taking that time to pause. You're going to process this. You can maybe walk it out, talk to a friend, journal to really try to process the situation. The whole idea is that when emotions are running high, we're in that really heightened, maybe angry state, and we're kind of throwing stones at our partner. And instead, we want to look at what's actually at stake for me here. And most of the time, it's we feel like our partner isn't in our corner, they don't have our back, and they're not really there for us. And that's how you can really return to the conversation through the lens of repair. And then when you do return to the conversation, it's really helpful to have really open communication and body language. Our words are one thing, but the way we say it and how we look when we say it tells our partner so much more. They're the most attuned people to us, and we can't really hide how we're truly feeling with them. So, one thing that's really helpful is to look at each other in the eyes and have your palms up and kind of put your palms on
So
top of each other.
interesting.
It's really remarkable and interesting to do this in any conflict because you'll note that it's very hard to be aggressive or defensive in these situations.
So give me an example of a couple that has really good communication over time.
Great question. I actually worked with a couple I saw earlier today, and they're about to go on their baby moon, and then they're gonna give birth at the end of the summer. So they were trying to find ways to create these rituals now where it's just the two of them and they can create space ahead of when life is going to get way more busy and complicated.
Super chaotic.
Beyond
Newborn is not
chaotic.
easy.
No, but it's so helpful to maybe anticipate that, and there's so much stress and anxiety that comes with all the unknown of having a child, and so one way to manage that anxiety is to say, "Hey, like, let's create this typical check-in and time just for us," and it's a way to set your relationship up for success, and also creating that habit and the skill of always kind of coming back to each other and making sure you're both feeling okay.
What advice would you give to those couples who are just engaged, ready to get married, and who want to be really intentional about long-term communication?
So, 3 things. 1, communicate regularly and openly. Try to get ahead of conflicts before they become a bigger situation. So, if you ever are noticing you're upset or you don't love the way that a dynamic is unfolding, to try to check in with yourself and also with your partner. 2 is practice kindness when you're disagreeing. And it can be really hard to put on the boxing gloves and try to win the argument, but instead it's really us versus the problem. So always try to center your relationship end goals as what you're really striving for and not trying to win. So even when you're so upset with your partner, start with reassuring them and assuming you're both on the same page and you have each other's back. And 3 is set up little rituals to feel connected and to create that emotional intimacy. Grand gestures are so nice, but it's really about the little things, the little moments that make us feel really loved and make us feel like our partner's really there and they have our
Is
back.
that like date night?
Absolutely. Date night, it's about getting them their favorite bakery item. It's about making them their coffee the way that they like. It's about showing them, I made space for you in my life and I know exactly what you need. It's about really loving our partners the way they want to be loved, not the way that we're kind of pushing our love onto them.
Okay, that did bring up another question. So there's this concept of love languages that I feel like everybody talks about now. And if you go on a date, like the first conversation is, what is your love language? Like, do our love languages match? Would you suggest that couples should have a conversation about their love languages? Does that really matter in the course of a long term relationship?
Absolutely. I think also identifying your love language, it ties back so much to what you did or didn't get as a child. And then maybe we're trying to over index or compensate for that in our adult relationships. To really try to understand where it comes from. Some people might say gift giving is their ultimate love language. And maybe that's what love felt like as a child. Maybe you didn't get the emotional resources you needed. So love was given to you financially, which goes back to why there's so many kind of financial difficulties and complications in love
So,
relationships.
do you think people typically mirror the love language that they experienced in childhood and recreate that in their romantic partnerships?
Great question. I think subconsciously there's always traces or like ghosts from our past in our current relationships. And we either can be really understanding and see that ghost and try to act against it or for our best intentions, or sometimes we might let that ghost run the show.
And it can be so hard. I feel like if you don't go through individualized therapy and have that level of introspection that is so important to be able to see your own behavior clearly, it can be hard in a relationship to understand your partner and understand where maybe you could course correct a little bit.
Absolutely. And sometimes we don't fully understand how these things have been operating in the background until we're in these closer
Yeah.
relationships. Relationships are so beautiful and they teach us a lot about ourselves. And so, even, which is why I say, amongst all the conflict and rupture, we're learning, we're growing, and hopefully we can move forward together.
What is your perspective on marriage?
I think marriage is so complicated. There's so many different fantasy ideals of marriage from when we're children, and we're kind of sold this idea that that's the end point. That's when you're finally going to be happy. And
You're
unfortunately,
happily ever after.
from when we're children. So it's kind of, we're indoctrinated to believe that. And when the reality doesn't match up to the fantasy, it can lead to so much disappointment, especially when we are looking at marriages through the eyes of our parents, and they might not be ideal. It might not be something we want to emulate. So I think marriage is so complicated. There's so many factors of managing. There's a greater trend of getting married much later in life, and that speaks to our focus on personal development, of career development, of feeling financially stable and secure. But it makes marriage a little bit more tricky. And I think it also speaks to reproductive planning. People are often making plans on their own. They might be freezing their eggs or embryos. And that speaks to one, our independence and autonomy, but it also requires much more conversation around these topics.
Oh my God, we could talk about this forever, and how they experience that and like how that can affect a relationship. Because I've seen in so many contexts recently women who are planning to marry later, right? They're in their mid 30s, they haven't found their person. They do want to be partnered, they do want to get married, they are excited to have that experience, but they're preserving their fertility because they don't know when that's going to happen and they don't want to feel rushed. And so I think it leads to this question of what happens when you do preserve and you now are getting into a partnership and you do need to have that conversation. It can get really complex.
Absolutely. We're having all these conversations that women and generations before us didn't even have the opportunity to do so. So, with great power comes great responsibility. And it speaks to having these more nuanced and challenging conversations in terms of how we're balancing our own autonomy with our partners, how we see our plans in terms of future, in terms of offspring, how we see our parenting styles. And again, it's so much more helpful to get ahead of these conversations instead of dealing with them when you're in the trenches and kind of overstressed and stimulated.
Well, I loved this conversation, Dr. Romanoff. Thank you so much for being here today. Where can everybody find you?
Thank you so much for having me. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Sabrina Romanoff, where I share tips on relationships and psychology and mental health.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.